Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a member of the PMDG 777 beta team. Welcome to this tutorial on flying Oceanic in the PMDG Boeing 777. If you're interested in an even more detailed written version of this, have a look at my Ultimate 777 Guide ebook. More on that in the video description below. And now let's get right into it. We are starting a little bit late actually, as we are already just about half an hour from our Oceanic entry point. But let's start right at the beginning. So depending on the FIR in which you are entering Oceanic airspace, you may or may not already have received your clearance at this point. Typically in Gander and Oceanic OCAs, you would make your request for the Oceanic clearance 90 to 60 minutes before the entry into the Oceanic airspace. In other FIRs, such as Reykjavik, you may only do it 20 minutes before, and in others like New York or Oakland, covering the entire Pacific, you basically don't need to do one at all. So procedures are a little bit different, but let's deal with the typical North Atlantic crossing on this one, where you have to make the request between 90 and 60 minutes before entering Oceanic airspace. Now, you can create a reminder for this using the fix page. So let's say that we know that we are going to reach our Oceanic entry fix at 0119, like over here. Then you could create a time marker on the fix page that is going to remind you of this. So normally we would create the time marker 90 minutes before the entry time, but for demonstrational purposes it is right now 0054, so let's just create a marker at 0100 just to show you how that's done. So you could do 0100 Zulu and enter that down here. It's important that you add the Zulu so that the FMC knows that you are entering a time and not an altitude. And now you can see that the time marker is drawn on the navigation display. And this serves as a good reminder as to when you can submit your clearance request. Be aware though that if you depart closer to the time of Oceanic entry, it may even be necessary to request a clearance on the ground. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail there, as most flights are going to have sufficient time to request it after they are in the air. Now, let's say that we need to request our clearance at 0100. As mentioned, that's a fictional number that I've just drawn up for this tutorial. Normally it is between 90 and 60 minutes before if you are entering through Shanwick or Gander OCA. Now, how are we going to request the clearance? Well, the easiest option is via CPDLC. And you can do this on the COM page if you go on to Flight Information and then Oceanic Clearance Request. And this tells you everything you need to enter. So let's start by going over the numbers one by one. So our call sign is automatically taken from the FMC's route facility. So that's the one you have over here in the flight number. Then the ATC facility means the log-on code of the FIR through which you enter Oceanic airspace. For example, if we have a look at our chart over here, we can see that we enter in the Gander Oceanic FIR, and this is Charlie Zulu Quebec X-Ray. So we're going to enter Charlie Zulu Quebec X-Ray as the ATC facility from which we want to request our Oceanic clearance. Next we need the entry point. That's the waypoint at which you are going to enter Oceanic airspace. Now, you can either get that from your chart, or I recommend to get it from the flight plan, as that is often a little bit clearer. So over here we can see we've got Buddha, and then we got Nuttrack Whiskey towards Rylet. So Buddha is going to be the Oceanic entry point. So again, we are going to type this into here, Buddha, and use that as entry point. Next comes the flight level, and that is already a little bit more tricky. So deciding on the Oceanic flight level is a bit of a tactical decision. We need to do a little forecast, and we need to judge how likely it is that we can do a step climb en route. Now, generally speaking, if you are flying a random route, it is very likely that you can get a step climb along your route. If you're flying a North Atlantic track, it is less likely that you will be able to get a step climb. So if you judge that you will be able to get a step climb, then just use the optimum flight level that you will have at the Oceanic entry point. Remember, the optimum level increases by about 100 feet every 10 to 13 minutes flight time. So if you take your flight time to the next waypoint, for example Buddha at 0119, we can say that's roughly 25 minutes. So we expect our optimum to increase by about 200 feet in that time, and the maximum as well. Now, if you expect that step climbs may not be possible, you want to enter the NAT as high as possible. So even though the recommended level may be 350 at the moment, we might request a higher flight level. And this is where the track message becomes relevant. So the daily North Atlantic tracks are published in the so-called North Atlantic track message. And this is what the track message looks like. We can see that Buddha and Nut Whiskey have available flight levels 350, 360, 370, 380 and 390. So as you can see, both odd and even levels are available along this route. For this reason, we may not only request 35 or 370 since we're flying eastbound, but we can also request flight level 360. Now, since the optimum and the maximum kinda have 360 right in the middle between one another, that is what I'm going to aim for over here. So Oceanic flight level 360, and we can enter that in here. Then we've got the ETA, and this is the ETA over your Oceanic entry point, so overhead Buddha. You can get this on the route data page, so that's via Lex and route data, and over here you can see Buddha 0119. The 777 FMC has another neat feature. Let's say you're flying through Europe and there are hundreds of waypoints before your Oceanic entry point. An easy way to get your ETA for the Oceanic entry point is through the progress page. If you just type the waypoint in, so for example we type Buddha, and then insert it onto your destination. Like this, you now see that it's picked the en route waypoint and it gives you the estimated time of arrival over that waypoint. That's a little shortcut you can use in the 777 FMC to get the ETA for any waypoint along your route, and it even works for waypoints that are not located on your route. So now that we know that it is 0119, we can go ahead and enter this as our ETA, and we can remove this again from the progress page. So that's just a very cool feature that the 777 features over here. Next up, we need to decide on our Oceanic Mach number. Now, normally we would simply go to the Lex page and select the nearest full Mach number to the ones that we have over here. So, for example, if the aircraft would like to fly 0.823, the closest full Mach number to that is 0.82, so that is what we are going to choose. So Mach 0.82. Finally, we've got the free text. And there is two important pieces of information that need to be included there. If you are flying along a North Atlantic track, then you need to include the TMI number that identifies the track message upon which your flight plan is based. So you can see that this track message is valid for only a certain period of time. And to identify this track message, you've got the track message identifier number down here. So TMI is 177. So if we fly on a NAT, we need to include the TMI 177, and we need to include that as a free text. If your maximum attainable flight level at the Oceanic entry point is different from the requested flight level, we also need to include this in the free text. Now, maximum attainable level doesn't mean that the maximum in here has to go, for example, to 370, and then we can say max level 370. But it has to be the maximum flight level that you are willing to accept over there. For example, if we had a very strong tailwind at a lower altitude and therefore our recommended level would be 320, and if we would then request flight level 320 over here, then we could tell the controller that our maximum is flight level 360, and this would be used when they issue the Oceanic clearance. Otherwise, the requested flight level is assumed as maximum flight level. And the way you would phrase this is max F360, for example. And you could enter that over here. Now, if the requested flight level is also the maximum attainable flight level, you don't need to include the maximum level, so we can delete this again. And this is what your Oceanic request would look like. When it is completely filled out, normally you would prepare this even before the earliest time where the clearance can be requested. So normally you'd prepare this as soon as you have some time available in your flight, and as soon as you reach the time marker 90 minutes before your entry point or at the applicable period in time. For example, on the Cross the Pond event on VATSIM, they normally want the clearance request 45 minutes prior to the Oceanic point. Then you can set yourself a time marker 45 minutes prior and can send the clearance then. But as soon as the clearance request is fully typed in and the time where you can request the clearance arrives, you simply press the send button, and then the clearance request is automatically transmitted to air traffic control. Now, since we are flying offline today, there will not be an answer to the clearance request that we just sent. For this reason, I have manually created an ATC clearance as you would normally receive it when you are flying on a North Atlantic track. And this is what a clearance might look like. So if we have a look at that, we can analyze the clearance as follows. It is a clearance issued at 1045 UTC on the 26th of June 2024. The issuing authority is Gander, which is Charlie Zulu Quebec X-Ray, and it is clearance number 993. You can use that clearance number to refer to the clearance at a later point if needed. Now, let's go over the contents of this clearance. Speedbird 11 Juliet, cleared to Heathrow via Buddha, Nut Track Whiskey. Below that, all the single waypoints of this nut track are listed. From Buddha at time 0119, maintain flight level 360 and Mach 0.83. End of message. End of message is very important, otherwise you have to assume that parts of the clearance are missing and therefore need to contact air traffic control to verify the clearance. So now that we know what our clearance looks like, let's go ahead and enter this into our FMC. So we're going to start with the lateral part of our clearance request. And we start on the legs page. So first of all, we have to reach Buddha at 0119. So the first thing we do is to verify the ETA. The sooner you check for this, the more time you have to correct if necessary. So let's assume for a second that we received a different ETA. Let's say ATC wants us to cross Buddha at 0120. There is two ways how you can achieve this. Either you can manually change the cruising speed on the VNAV page until you see the correct time for Buddha, or you can use the RTA page. Now let's have a look at how RTA works. If you go to Progress and then press RTA Progress twice, then you've got the RTA required time at Progress page. If we enter Buddha over here, we can now see that the aircraft expects to reach Buddha at 0115 and 30 seconds, 0.5. But if we need to reach it at any different point, we can enter that up here. So let's say we need to reach Buddha at 0120, for an example. You can enter that up here, and with that the aircraft is going to calculate the speed change that it needs, and it is going to tell you if it is unable to meet that change. So this way, if you now press execute, VNAV would adjust the speed in order to reach the waypoint at the required time. Now, today we don't need to do this, because today we have been issued with a clearance to reach Buddha at 0119, and you always have 2 minutes before or after the assigned time at which you can reach the waypoint. So 0119 and a half, it's not a problem at all. Even if it would read 0121, you could still just keep going at your current pace. You just got to make sure that the ETA does not get any later. Now that our routing is assured, we can go ahead, or now that our ETA is assured, we can go ahead and program and check our route. So if we have a look at the track message, we will see that we are cleared via Buddha, Nut Track Whiskey, and below that are all the waypoints of Nut Track Whiskey. So we've got 5030 or 50 and a half north, 50 west, which is H, which denotes a half coordinate. 50 stands for 50 north, so H50 means 50.5 and 50 degrees west. If you did not do the Oceanic waypoint cross-check in the FMC setup, then you can do it now. So let's go over that real quick. You copy the waypoint out of the legs page, then you click initRef, index, nav data, and you enter the waypoint up here on the idents. And over here you get the exact coordinates of the waypoint in question. So we can verify that H5050 is indeed 50 degrees and a half north and 50 degrees west. We got to do that for every single waypoint that we have in our flight plan to verify that they are all correct. Now, if you followed this tutorial carefully, you will have noticed that we have already completed this check on the ground, and for that reason, we don't need to worry about repeating that check. So let's go on with the vertical part of our clearance. If you have a look at the second to last line, you can see that we got from Buddha at 0119, we got to maintain flight level 360. So what we do is we are going to enter the step climb to flight level 360 on the legs page. I've done this earlier in this tutorial, so for the purpose of showing you again, I'm just going to delete this. So you can see by default, the FMC wants to cross Buddha at flight level 350. We need to include a reminder that we need to do the step climb. So you can insert that by typing 360S, and S denotes that the constraint we're entering is a step climb. And we can insert that after Buddha, like this, press execute, and now if we look at the nav display, you can see that a step climb point has been created at Buddha. If we continue with our Oceanic clearance, we can see behind the flight level, so behind the F360, we got Mach 0.83. So this is a slight difference from what we requested. We requested Mach 8.2, we got Mach 8.3. So we enter this as a speed constraint, 0.83 slash, and we enter that at the Oceanic entry point. And now if we execute this, the airplane is automatically going to keep flying at the most economic speed, which currently is 0.823, until we reach our Oceanic entry point Buddha. And as you can see over here on the ND, the airplane is going to resume Mach 0.83 once we overfly Buddha. Now, especially in case that a long segment of flight follows the Oceanic segment, it may be a good idea to re-enter the Econ cruise speed after the nut. And you can do this by typing E/ and inserting that on the Oceanic exit point. So we got Rylet over here, and if you just insert E/, you will see that Econ speed is now entered as speed constraint from Rylet. So the airplane is now going to maintain Mach 0.83 from Buddha throughout the entire nut until Rylet, and after Rylet it is going to assume the cost index based Econ speed once again. And this way we've now entered the entire nut crossing in our legs page. Now, since we inserted the entire clearance, we got to run another cross-check, and this is because Oceanic navigation relies on correct entries in the FMC. So in order to be absolutely sure that our entries are really correct, we got to do a track and distance cross-check as well. So we can do this through the flight plan. If we have a look at our flight plan here, we can see that from Buddha we're going to proceed to the first waypoint. And if you now compare this with the legs page, we can see that we're scheduled to fly on a track on this part down here. We can see initial magnetic track, initial true track. So if we go all the way down, you can see our initial magnetic track and our initial true track are 094 and 077 respectively after Buddha, with a distance of 82 nautical miles to the first waypoint. Now, if we compare this 094 versus 086 in the FMC, that is quite an error. And to be honest, SimBrief is calculating an incorrect track over here. Normally, the track and the distance need to be within 4 degrees of one another. Otherwise, you need to assume a navigational error. I brought this to SimBrief's attention, so they're hopefully going to fix that in the future. But to resume the check, we look at the track, compare that with the track in our legs page, and then we compare the distance, so 82 miles versus 82 miles in the legs page. Then we continue from 53.5 north 50 west, we continue to 51.5 north 40 west, that is on a track 092, and in here we got 095, so that's within an acceptable distance, and at a distance of 382 miles, and now since we had an ETOPS entry point in between, we gotta add up 95 plus 287. Okay, if we add that up, we indeed end up roundabout at 382 miles. Slight differences can happen due to turns that are included along the route of flight. We continue this check, so next up is 097 with 263 plus 111, so that's 374. And if we look at this, we got 092, 374 until 30 west. We continue towards 20 west, and again 095 is the track and lots of mileages to be added over here, so that is 365, and indeed in here we got 365 on 098. So like that you can compare all the tracks and the distances for the entire net. So from 20 west we proceed towards Tobor, track 095, 183 miles, and in here we got 096, 183 miles. So that checks, and then from Tobor we continue to Rylet, which is a track 100, 37 miles, and we got, well, 95, 37 miles. So again the track is incorrect in here. We'll just leave it at that. So, that way we have now checked that our entire net clearance is correctly entered in the legs page. As we are now continuing to fly towards our Oceanic entry point, we need to keep monitoring our ETA at the Oceanic entry point and make sure that we don't differ from our clearance by more than 3 minutes. So from 3 minutes onwards, you need to request a new Oceanic clearance. In some cases that can be done through the domestic controller. Shannon and Gander are usually very responsive in such cases. In other cases you might just have to send an entire new Oceanic clearance request, which you can send at any time. So let's just get rid of the ACAS page over here. Now, as we're about to approach our Oceanic entry, we need to lock on CPDLC, so we can bring the ACAS page right back. So we can go to ACAS and then lock on, and on here we lock on to the first sector within which we are going to enter Oceanic airspace. So in our case, that's Gander, so Charlie Zulu Quebec X-ray. Lock on 2, and then you just send the lock on. Now, since we are not flying this tutorial online, we cannot lock onto the station, so we are just going to get an error there. But in the real world, you need to lock on CPDLC. It is mandatory to use CPDLC in the North Atlantic high-level airspace. So you would need to send the lock on, and then you would eventually get your lock on. As we are approaching our Oceanic waypoint, it is our responsibility to ensure that we have reached our Oceanic level by the time we reach our Oceanic entry point. So we're currently cruising in 350, but we need to be in 360 by the time we overfly Budar. So at this point, we can go ahead and request our step climb from air traffic control. ATC will facilitate that you get the step climbs. In many cases, domestic ATC is even going to ask you when you want to do the step climb, because they really try to ensure that you enter the Oceanic airspace at the correct altitude and time, but it is not their responsibility to ensure that. It is your responsibility as a pilot. For that reason, we have now requested our step climb. We are now climbing up to flight level 360. I'm going to use level change mode here so that the step climb happens a little smoother than it would using VNAV. We talked about that in the cruise tutorial already. So, now that we're approaching our Oceanic entry point, we ensured that we have our correct time. We are right now ensuring that we climb to the correct flight level, and with that we are basically ready to enter Oceanic airspace. At some point shortly prior to the entry point, usually some 20 or 30 miles ahead of the entry point, and once all your Oceanic flight level has been resumed, you are going to get a handoff to the Oceanic controller. And Oceanic controllers typically use HF frequencies. Gander is a little exception, they initially use VHF. Nonetheless, it's basically the same procedure on VHF and HF. For that reason, I'm going to detail the HF example in this flight. So, we've now assumed our Oceanic level, and with that we are basically fully prepared for our Oceanic crossing. Now, when the Oceanic handoff is received, we are going to get an HF frequency. Say, for example, Speedbird 11 Juliet, contact Gander 4695. Then you go ahead onto the HF radio and you dial in 4695. Like that. Switch it active, change over to the HF radio down there, and before we can transmit, we gotta dial into the frequency. We do this just by pressing the transmit button once, so like that, press the mic, and then the antenna is tuned to that frequency. Only thereafter, on a second transmit, that is when you can talk to air traffic control on that frequency. Phraseology is basically the same across all Oceanic facilities. They always want to know the call sign of the station that you're trying to call, your own call sign, cell call check, and what the next FIR is if you are crossing into another Oceanic FIR. So on today's flight, we're going to cross from Gander into Shanwick Oceanic. So the initial call would look like that. Gander radio, Speedbird 11 Juliet, cell call check, Shanwick next. And then the controller is going to respond with a whole load of information that we gotta write down. So stay prepared, things are getting interesting now. Speedbird 11 Juliet, Gander radio, secondary frequency 10021 at 30 west, contact Shanwick, primary 6654, secondary 4092. Here comes your cell call. You wait until the cell call is received, and only when the cell call is received, you're going to respond like this. Speedbird 11 Juliet, cell call OK, your secondary 10021, at 30 west, contact Shanwick, 6654, secondary 4092. Normally the controllers are going to reply with their call sign, something like Gander, and that's it. That's your radio communication complete. You can turn off your HF radio and resume VHF left communications. And now we have a couple of things to dial in. So now we have our primary frequency, 4695, and we got the controller's secondary frequency, 10021. We dial the primary frequency in on HF left, and the secondary frequency on HF right. So over here we are going to insert 10021. So 10021. Make sure to tune the antenna, so we select HF right and just select the mic for a short moment. That tunes the antenna to the frequency. Once the antenna is tuned, you can deselect it again. And now at 30 degrees west, we also got our Shanwick frequencies already. So that is going to be 6654 primary. So we've got 6654, and we tuned that on the left HF standby radio. And then we got the secondary Shanwick frequency, which we're going to tune on the right HF standby radio, which is 4092. So we can dial that in down here again. We've got 4092, and you keep that on standby over there. And that is your comm setup for your oceanic crossing. Now, at some time after you've passed into the oceanic airspace, your controller is going to send you a confirm assigned route CPDLC message. When confirm assigned route is received, what happens is that the aircraft is going to send the entire routing that you have in your legs page, including the crossing times, the flight levels, the speeds, and all your constraints, over to air traffic control. ATC uses that to cross-check the data of your flight, and they will verify that all your FMC entries are correct. If you have an incorrect FMC entry at this point, you're going to get a cell call and they will tell you via voice, and chances are they might file a report on you, so better make sure that everything is correct. Now this cross-check, this confirm assigned route check that ATC is going to conduct, is the reason why we must not modify the legs page in the oceanic segment. You must keep everything exactly to the standard route. No equal time point, no ETOPS point, no nothing. We would be using the fixed pages for that, as I have explained in the ETOPS tutorial. So once we enter oceanic airspace, we got to do a couple of things. First of all, 10 minutes after entry, we need to select Squawk 2000. And we can set ourselves a time marker through the fixed page again. So we entered at time 0119, so we can enter a time marker at 0129 on our navigation display as a reminder that we have to select Squawk 2000 at that point. The reason why we select Squawk 2000 is because the domestic air traffic controllers on the eastern and the western side of the Atlantic, the same goes for any other oceanic area, do not cooperate in terms of transponder assignments. So basically, a squawk can be double assigned, one time on the American side and the other time on the European side of the Atlantic. For this reason, we go Squawk 2000 in order not to cause any confusion on any ATC system 10 minutes after the oceanic entry. Also, we have to consider using strategic lateral offset procedures, or in short, SLOP. Now, many parts of the world, not only oceanic parts, but also, for example, some FIRs over Africa or over Asia, use SLOP procedures. SLOP means that you deviate from the assigned route by either 1 or 2 nautical miles to the right of your track. Always deviate to the right, never to the left. In the 777 this is quite easy to be done. So you go onto the route page, and down here you have the offset feature. Let's say today we want to fly 1 mile offset to the right. Well, we can actually make this easier. We do have some traffic in front of us, and he seems to be flying, well, somewhere. Okay, we can't do this easier then. So let's say that we want to deviate 1 mile to the right. You enter 1R into the offset down here, and now you have 2 ways of doing this. Either you can just press execute. In that case, the aircraft is automatically going to assume 1 mile offset to the right. We can see this nicely down here on our nav display if we select a low range. But the aircraft might use a very sharp angle to intercept. So you can see we're banking 30 degrees right now, and this is a rather hard intercept. Some pilots just tend to use heading select and do something like heading 100 just to achieve a lesser intercept angle, because that avoids high bank angles and therefore increases passenger comfort. In any case, SLOP may only be flown in LNAV, so once the SLOP has been assumed, you must be using LNAV and you must not carry out a SLOP in heading select mode. If your FMC is not capable of running SLOP, then you must not fly SLOP, then you must assume the center line. Now, just to avoid any confusion, SLOP does not require you to turn offset. You may also fly the center line. Different pilots are using different procedures. Personally, I make it a strategic decision. Let's say that we had other aircraft flying around us. One aircraft is above us, one aircraft is below us. I want to position myself in a way that if I have a rapid decompression, I can immediately start the descent on the turn to the right without running into the other aircraft. Therefore, if we are flying 1 mile offset to the right, then an aircraft above us would reasonably fly 2 miles offset to the right, so that if they get a decompression and deviate to the right, they can't run into us anymore. Likewise, if I have an aircraft below me that flies the center line, I would fly 1 mile offset to the right. If the aircraft below me is slopping 1 right, I would go 2 right, so that I'm flying on the right of that aircraft. If the aircraft below me is already going 2 miles right offset, I can't go more than 2 miles, so for that reason I'm just going to fly 2 miles to the right as well then. And then we just have to live with it. But like that you can make a strategic decision on your SLOP procedures. Now whenever you cross a waypoint, like we just did over here at 50 West, whenever you cross a waypoint, of course you carry out a fuel check, and you also carry out a check of the distance to the next waypoint, just to reassure yourself that you are still on the correct route and haven't done any entry errors. Now this basically concludes our standard procedures. We're just about passing our time marker, 10 minutes into the Oceanic crossing, so now we can set 2000 on the transponder. Also, as soon as you're out of the VHF radio range of your previous controller, we are going to select frequencies as follows. Once you're outside of the radio reception range of the previous controller, select 123.45, which is the air-to-air frequency active on your COM number 1, so on VHF left, 12345. On VHF right, we are going to use the emergency frequency 121.5, and we make sure that we monitor both of them. Now, the air-to-air frequency 123.45 is normally going to be used for inter-pilot communications, and especially when flying on the North Atlantic tracks, you will notice a lot of chatter about turbulence along the tracks. For example, we're flying along track Whiskey right now. If we were encountering turbulence and we wanted to know if turbulence would also be on other flight levels, then we could ask something on 12345, such as any station on track Whiskey at 50 West, do you encounter turbulence? And like that we could get turbulence reports from other aircraft that would hopefully be useful to get a different altitude in order to reduce the effects of turbulence. Now, the North Atlantic as well as the Pacific are areas where clear air turbulence is very common, so if you are flying several thousand kilometers across an ocean, chances are at some point you are going to encounter turbulence. And for this, the air-to-air frequency 123.45 is a very helpful frequency. Now, let's go ahead and just quickly correct my FMS, because I didn't press Alt Intervent for the step climb, so I'm just going to enter it in here, and here we go. So, let's go ahead and have a look at a couple of procedures that may be very useful when flying transatlantic. So, in an area where radar vectors, or rather where radar is available, you would normally deviate around weather by radar vectors. Especially in Europe this is commonly the case, like request heading 120 to avoid. We cannot do this on the North Atlantic. Since there is no radar vectors available, and since there is no radar coverage available, we need to deviate around weather by requesting an offset from the current route. So you can do that on the COM page, ATC, and then you have route requests. And in here, you can request a weather deviation up to so many miles. Let's say that there was a build-up right in front of us. We would analyze the build-up using the weather radar, and then decide how many miles we need to offset in order to avoid that weather. And you can request offsets into both directions, left and right. Now, let's say we decide we need a 20 miles offset to the right to to avoid the weather. Then we can enter 20 right, and then we request a weather deviation up to 20 nautical miles to the right. Now let's see, it didn't want 20R, let's try R20. Okay, here we go. So now you can request that weather deviation from your air traffic controller. There is two possibilities of what can happen. Either you are going to get the weather deviation approved, or you will get an unable message back. Let's take the easy message first. Let's say that the weather deviation is approved. In that case, we would go ahead and enter our deviation on the offset, so enter 20 right. And now there is two possibilities, and depending on which pilot you ask, you are going to get a different answer. So some pilots are going to say that you may only fly the weather deviation using LNAV. There are a couple of technical backgrounds for that, however, that is not always a practical solution. So when your deviation is approved, you can enter 20 right, and you can simply go ahead and execute that offset, and then the airplane is going to assume that offset route. But there is another way how you can do this. The other way is as follows. You can use heading select, execute the deviation, and now the FMC shows, now the navigation display shows you exactly within which area you are allowed to deviate around the weather. Remember the request, deviation up to 20 nautical miles to the right. That means we can fly anywhere in between this area. And now we could use heading select in order to fly anywhere in here and fly around any thunderstorm cells or build-ups that we might encounter. Depending on the scenario, both solutions are acceptable, and both solutions ultimately lead to the same result. When using the heading select method, it might happen that LNAV does not sequence the waypoint. So if we were to deviate while we fly around this waypoint over here, then it might happen that the waypoint is not sequenced when we are flying in heading select. This would mean ATC does not get a position report from the aircraft, and it would mean that we get incorrect indications on our FMC, and we need to avoid that. So make sure that your waypoint sequences. If not, you can always use the lex page in order to enter in order to sequence the waypoint manually by just copying the next one active. When you do that, you got to be careful that you retain the center line in here. You must not fly direct from a position somewhere in space to the next waypoint, but you must always resume the previous center line. You can do that by carrying out a radial indirect like this. So let's say we passed 40 west and we have to resume a route inbound 30 west. The way you would do this is you've got 092 as an inbound track here. You can copy that active, and now you've got the intercept course 2. And in here you can select 092, and now you can see that the airplane basically draws the extended center line of the route. But that's just, you should avoid that from happening in first place, so that you always keep your original route down here. When the weather avoidance is complete, you would go ahead and remove the offset. So let's say we were flying 20 miles right, you would change that back to your original SLOP, let's say 1 right, execute that, and then you can use LNAV in order to intercept that track again and keep proceeding on that track. There is one problem. ATC is not always able to issue such a request or such a clearance. If we take a look at our flight plan, we can easily explain why. So if we have a look at our general route chart up here, we can see that there are several North Atlantic tracks north and south of us. Now, we are currently flying on a PBCS track. That means the next track is located just 30 minutes, which equals 30 nautical miles, to the left of us. Likewise, the next track on our right is 30 nautical miles to the right of us. If we request a weather deviation that would lead us into the other track and there is another aircraft flying on that track, then ATC cannot issue the clearance to avoid that weather. For this case, there are North Atlantic contingency procedures, and we want to have a look at a couple of those contingency procedures right now. So, I'm using a little banner from the ops group for this one, which I really liked. I'm going to link the original article, which I can very much recommend, in the video description below, so be sure to check that one out. It is really highly recommendable. So we are going to start with the weather deviation that we see on the lower part of this banner. And in here we can see, if a weather deviation is required and no clearance can be obtained, then we got to apply a contingency procedure. So if your weather deviation is less than 5 nautical miles from the route and ATC advises that they are unable to grant you the clearance, you still carry out the deviation, you never fly into the weather. If you can't get ATC clearance, doesn't matter, never fly into the weather. If you need to deviate 5 nautical miles or less from your assigned route, maintain your assigned flight level. But if you need to deviate more than 5 nautical miles from your route, you can apply a little acronym down there, and that is SAND. If you need to deviate south of track, you need to climb, ascend by 300 feet. If you deviate north of the track, you need to descend by 300 feet. Personally, I like to use another reminder for that, and that is if I need to deviate towards the pole, then I need to descend. If I need to deviate towards the equator, I need to climb. This offset by 300 feet is applied so that aircraft cannot collide if they get closer than the minimum separation from one another. As soon as you are able to resume your standard routing and are within 5 nautical miles of your assigned flight level, return back to the originally cleared flight level. So to summarize this, if you are unable to get a clearance from air traffic control to deviate around the weather, descend by 300 feet if you are deviating to the pole, and climb by 300 feet if you're deviating to the equator. So let's talk about the second contingency case that we have. The second case is if something happens where we are able to maintain our flight level. So let's say, for example, a passenger gets ill or we have smoke in the aircraft. In those cases, we need to initiate a diversion. If it is not possible to get ATC clearance, the first step is always to try and call for ATC clearance. You even got a field for that in your CPDLC. So you've got the COM page, ATC, and then you got emergency report at the top. Over here, you can enter anything that you want to do. For example, you can declare a mayday. You can say that I'm diverting to, let's say, for example, Charlie Yankee Julia Tango. I'm diverting to Stephenville. And you can fill out the rest as needed. If you do this, then normally you should be able to obtain an ATC clearance rather quickly. If you're unable to obtain an ATC clearance, let's have a look into the contingency chart for what we're going to do next. So, if you look at the left of the chart, you can see number 1, try to get revised ATC clearance. Always try that first. The safest way to proceed is always via ATC clearance. However, if we have a look at number 2, if no clearance is available, turn at least 30 degrees offset to the right. Maintain the flight level and minimize the descent, and have a good look at the airborne collision avoidance system and watch out visually for traffic. Turn on all your aircraft lights and then make a broadcast on the in-flight emergency frequency 1 to 1.5 or on the in-flight air-to-air frequency 1 to 3.45. Set your squawk 7700 and use the SATCOM to try and reach ATC as necessary. So, To revise, fly offset 30 degrees to the right in order to establish on a 5 nautical mile offset track. Be sure your TCAS is active and working, and also watch out visually for other traffic. Turn on all your aircraft's light and make a broadcast on the emergency frequency 1 to 1.5. If we look at step number 3, we are going to establish 5 nautical miles offset from the original routing to the right. And now we got to decide between the options we have available. If we're able to maintain the flight level, then we need to do a vertical offset by 500 feet below flight level 410 or 1000 feet above flight level 410. This is so that you fly exactly in between all available flight levels in order to minimize the collision risk. So, offset to the right. When you're 5 nautical miles offset, climb or descend by 500 feet. There is no rule that would dictate whether you have to climb or descend. So, say for example, if there is an aircraft 1000 feet below you on the TCAS, you might prefer to climb 500 feet. If there is an aircraft 500 feet above you, you might prefer to descend 500 feet. Make a sensible decision based on the traffic situation around you. The other option that we have is to descend below flight level 290. The background here is that the North Atlantic high-level airspace and most cruise levels for any aircraft that is commonly able to cross the Atlantic are flight level 290 or above. For that reason, your second option is to descend below flight level 290. Which of the two options you pick is up to you. It's up to the pilot. So let's say, for example, if you would encounter a significant headwind below level 290, then it might be the better idea to stay up at higher levels and assume the 500-foot offset. If there is no significant deterioration in the winds and there is nothing preventing you from a descent, by all means descend below flight level 290 once you have established 5 nautical miles offset, as that is going to provide you with the best clearance of other traffic, as most oceanic traffic is going to be at or above flight level 290. As soon as the other flight level has been attained, you can initiate your diversion, but you should try at all points to receive an ATC clearance. Normally they are very fast if the CPDLC's emergency menu is used, or if you just declare a mayday via HF. Normally they are very fast and will be able to give you a clearance. However, in case it is not possible, use this procedure over here. Try to get clearance. If unable, turn at least 30 degrees offset to establish on a 5 nautical miles offset. Be sure that you maintain your level or minimize the descent as much as possible. Use TCAS and keep a visual lookout for traffic and turn all the lights on and make in-flight broadcasts. For example, like this. Mayday, 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 Speedbird 11 Juliet, cargo fire, resuming 5 miles offset to the right from Nuttrack Whiskey, descending flight level 290. That would be a typical announcement you could make in order to make the other aircraft around you aware of what is happening. As soon as you are established on the offset by 5 nautical miles, adjust your altitude as needed, and once you are clear of the flight levels that would normally be used for cruise, let's say you climbed 500 feet, you established yourself in flight level 365, then you can start turning to your ultimate airport as quickly as possible. Otherwise, once you've descended below level 290, you can start turning towards the ultimate airport as quickly as possible. You will find all of this information linked on the Ops Group website, which I'm going to include a link to in the video description below. So have a good look at that. They are really good for practical information about flying. I can very much recommend them, and I will link them in the video description below. So now that we talked about what you can do if you're able to maintain your altitude, let us quickly talk about what to do if you are not able to maintain altitude. Now, there are two cases in which you might not be able to maintain altitude. Well, 3 if you count aircraft damage. So the first one is a rapid decompression. The second one is an engine failure. Let's start with the rapid decompression. So if a rapid decompression occurs, on top of the normal procedures that you carry out according to your memory items anyway, what you will do is you will apply the same 30-degree turn at least in order to establish 5 miles right offset. My personal recommendation here, and this is not official procedure, but my personal recommendation is that when you initiate the emergency descent, you go on heading select 30 degrees offset, but as soon as you are turning, enter 5 right as an offset in your FMC, execute that and return to using LNAV. The reason I recommend this is because simulator training experience shows that many crews get so distracted by all the emergency procedures they need to carry out that they forget to assume the 5 miles offset and simply keep flying on the heading and fly right into the traffic on the adjacent nut track. For that reason, try to return to LNAV as soon as possible. In the best case, just initiate the turn in heading select and then immediately return to flying an offset and return to using LNAV. From there on, carry out your standard emergency descent, declare your mayday, either using CPDLC or using HF radios. I strongly recommend CPDLC if available, it's just much easier, and then follow your standard operating procedures. Things get a little bit more interesting if we're talking about an engine failure. So if an engine failure happens across the North Atlantic, then obviously we are not able to maintain our altitude for very long. But we need to try to maintain altitude as long as possible in order not to descend into the nearest lower traffic. I will do a separate dedicated video where I'm going to demonstrate an engine failure in the North Atlantic environment, but for now, let's summarize as follows. The 777's VNAV system is capable of minimizing the rate of descent. So when the engine failure happens, you dial down the altitude and VNAV is going to maintain altitude and set the remaining engine to maximum continuous thrust so that the speed loss while maintaining altitude is minimized. When the calculated optimum descent speed is reached, VNAV will start a descent with the remaining engine, the one that is not failed, at maximum continuous thrust. This is going to give you a couple 100 feet a minute rate of descent and therefore minimizes your rate of descent until you have attained 5 nautical miles offset to the right. Once you are 5 miles offset to the right, you can go to level change and initiate a normal descent down to your drift down altitude. More on the topic of engine failures in a dedicated separate video. The important thing here to take away from this is if you have an engine failure flying in the North Atlantic tracks, you try to maintain your altitude by trading airspeed as long as possible. Be sure that the remaining engine is in maximum continuous thrust so that the airspeed loss is minimized, and like that normally you're going to be able to maintain your altitude for half a minute or even a minute, which should be more than enough so that you can turn out to the right and deviate away from any other traffic that might be immediately below you. And this basically concludes our North Atlantic tutorial. I will just cover one more item, and that is crossing 30 west, or rather crossing your Oceanic point where you transition into the next FIR. If we take a look at our en route chart again, we can see that at 30 west we are going to transition from Gander into Shanwick Oceanic airspace. There are two possibilities of what can happen with your frequency change. In many cases, or rather in many FIRs, as all FIRs apply slightly different procedures, in many FIRs you will get your Oceanic frequency, so the frequency for the next controller, when you do your initial call with the current controller. So as I demonstrated earlier, when you check in, he will tell you at 30 degrees west, contact that and that frequency. Now, some FIRs work slightly different. Some FIRs might not give you the next frequency immediately, but much rather are going to advise you to contact the next station at a certain period in time. So, for example, they might advise you, let's say 10 minutes before 30 west, at time so and so, contact Shanwick frequency, you name it. So this could happen as well. There is one situation in which you might find yourself in a position where it is hard to judge when to contact ATC, and that is when crossing from New York into Gander. Now, the crossing from New York into Gander is based on the latitude rather than the longitude. So they would say, for example, at 4430 north, contact Gander on frequency so-and-so. There might not necessarily be a waypoint associated with that, but the 777 FMC has a very nice feature that you can use in order to check this. So you can enter either a latitude or a longitude on the LAX page, and that is going to create a waypoint intersecting the route at that latitude or longitude. So let's give this a try. We've got a waypoint here at 40 degrees west, and we've got a waypoint at 30 degrees west. So let's say that we need a reminder at 35 degrees west. What you can do is as follows. You enter W35, the other way around, 35W. So you enter 35W, 35 degrees west, and enter that on the LAX page. Normally, and I'm going to write this up as a bug report in this tutorial, this should create a waypoint, an artificial waypoint at 35 degrees west. Right now this doesn't seem to work in the PMDG 777. I will write down a bug report so that this gets fixed, but this is just a way you can use in order to create yourself a reminder. Just be sure that when the reminder waypoint is created, you do not execute this, but much rather you copy it and insert it on a fixed page. This way you did not modify the LAX page. Remember, we are not allowed to modify the LAX page on an Oceanic segment. Well, and this concludes our Oceanic tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope that you enjoyed this one. Be sure to let me know your feedback in the comments below. I'm very much looking forward to it. And if you're up for more, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Finally, if you really love what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. And if you want to read up on all of these procedures and even more background information, I can very much recommend my Ultimate 777 Guide ebook. More on that in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.